Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to recap because I'm now recording on the video camera that the internet is out all over the neighborhood, and so I am zooming from my phone, and I've got the external video camera recording. That's what I'll be able to upload after the fact for people who want to watch or participate in the class later on. But for you, you folks who are zooming with us on my phone, if you'll speak extra loud, because my speakers are just kind of having trouble making the volume loud enough for everybody to hear. But we will be on chapter 10. We're going to be talking about bones. Dem bones. So before I start, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we give you humble and grateful thanks that we can gather together here in person. We can gather online via technology or even after the fact. You have bound us together in ways that we never could, and we are grateful and we are thankful. As we learn and talk and discuss about the bones which knit us together from the inside out, may you continue to knit us together as your holy body. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, good. All right. So talking about bones, and he gives this the subtitle, A Necessary Frame. And I'm assuming that's, pretty straightforward. You don't have to read the chapter to make some guesses about how your bones create a frame for you that is necessary. But off the get-go, any quick thoughts or reflections about that subtitle, A Necessary Frame?
We would be
For a
very reverent
skeleton,
without
it's
it.
what gives the form for everything else in our body.
Yeah, form. I mean, it gives the form for everything else in our body. Mary Lou said we'd be very rubbery without it.
And we wouldn't have the freedom of movement that we
True.
do if we were just a big blob.
Sure, no freedom of movement if you're a blob, because you're just a blob. It's sort of worth noting that the two components, the necessary part and the frame part, and we've hit necessary because without it we would be up a creek. The frame part, I would say, nature gives us two other examples or two other modes of connectivity, and that is exoskeletons, where the binding material is on the outside of the body, keeping all the tissue on the inside, the carapace of a beetle perhaps, and then those creatures or organisms that have no skeletal frame at all, whether we're talking about something relatively large like a big slug, or even microscopic organisms, an amoeba that don't have a skeletal structure as we would understand it. And none of those would you call a frame. So the necessary part we know. The frame part, I think, is just kind of a nice little reminder that even though there are other ways in which God could have made us, He made us with scaffolding on the inside. And that is how we operate. Not like insects, who have a nice hard protective shell, perhaps, but no softness, no tenderness to the touch. If you get to the soft part of an insect, that's because you've smushed them. And the same thing with things like with no frames or skeletons at all, the slugs or the amoebas. That they're nothing but softness, and there is no stability, rigidity, and very little, very little protection. not reliable are they? How resilient are they when any force coming from the outside, there's nothing to stop it from going all the way into them or even through them. And so, that concept, it's a frame. And what do frames do?
Hold things up.
Hold things up. They support.
They give them a form.
Give them a form. You give things a shape. Anytime we talk about framing something, we're talking about kind of corralling it into a position or a form that can stay. If something were that's either very soft that it might spread, or something that's very, very fragile, you frame a picture so that the picture is protected and it stays. And again, we're talking about this internal framing, but that is where having a moment to actually consider what these things mean. We don't have the tendency to do very much of. We take it for granted or we don't consider it. But almost everything that we are capable of doing physically happens and is able to continue because of this framework inside of us. Okay, so every chapter seems to start with a little anecdotal story. What's this one?
His finding or looking over bones in the attic.
Looking over bones. So these old bones, they're actually in Copenhagen.
And they're lepers.
These are the bones of lepers. And so there's a doctor who has collected these and learned a lot about the disease process without ever actually encountering a living patient. And I think that's pretty interesting. How much you could deduce after the fact just by examining the skeletal remains, especially old ones.
Missing teeth told him that leprosy strikes cooler parts of the body.
Missing teeth says that the leprosy was striking cooler parts of the body. So how did that little passage strike you?
I would have thought that the head was a warm part because of all the blood vessels going to the brain. So I'm confused by the cooler part.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out cooler parts.
All right. Well, any other thoughts on that? Anybody? Marion?
Hands and feet are always what gets colder.
Sure.
Cold temperatures.
Sure. They're extended further away from the body. In medical terms, we make relative reference to positions on the body because you can't just say left or right sometimes or you can't say up or down in a consistent fashion depending on is the person standing up, are they laying down, and they're in the front of the, whatever. So for that, they talk about proximal and distal. Proximal means closer to the center of the body, and distal means further away. So, for instance, your fingertips are distal to, say, your shoulder. Your shoulder is much closer to the center of your body. So which one would we assume is cooler? The fingertips of the shoulder.
Fingertips.
The fingertips. And so when they talk about like hypothermia, somebody's out in the woods or something, and you start losing sensation fingers and toes first. Like people who have frostbite, what gets frostbitten first? Fingers and toes. Anything else? How about any word from up in frozen Maine?
Your nose.
Your nose. And the tips of your ears. Soft tissue that sticks out away from the warm center mass of your body is considered cooler in the sense of it has less ability. You make the pile of coals and they all keep each other warm, but the one that kind of bounces off to the side, it goes out first. So my assumption is the teeth, while they are vascular in the pulp, are not actually vascular through the hard dentin, through the tough bony part. And they're not surrounded by warmth of muscle and ligament. They're exposed to an open mouth.
Okay, that makes sense.
So it's kind of a double whammy of something that doesn't have a real ample blood supply, and it has exposure to the air. But he kind of is able to figure some of this stuff out. Now, looking at skeletal remains, where would you assume he could find leprosy damage more easily?
Hands and feet.
Hands and feet.
Yeah.
And that seems to go along the lines of what Dr. Brand has noticed in real patients, you know. If we're talking about that, the lack of sensation, the lack of feeling, and you're bumping into things, you're cutting things, stuff is getting infected, what parts of the body tend to get the most wear and tear but our hands and our feet? But if the guy keeps also finding missing teeth, not just once or twice, but over and over and over again, well, maybe you start deducing that becomes a susceptible place as well. Can you imagine any other reasons why somebody with leprosy might lose teeth?
If they had a toothache, they probably wouldn't know.
A toothache that they don't know about? What else?
Probably nutrition.
Okay, nutrition. If you are not maybe feeling the sensation of hunger enough, or eating is difficult, and you're not getting in it, or just the fact that you're ostracized from society and not able to have a balanced diet, and your teeth will suffer from that.
You wouldn't have dental care.
And your body takes the calcium. I don't know if everybody would know this, but your body takes the calcium from your teeth when it needs it in other parts of your body.
Sure. Well, let's go back to that hypothermia example again. Part of the reason that you get the frostbite damage on your fingers and toes is your body will start compensating and pulling the blood flow to where it's more critical, into your chest and into your head. It's like, if I have to get rid of something, I can't get rid of my heart, but I could lose a few fingers and toes if I had to and still live. And so your body shuts down from the periphery first, and then slowly but surely can work inward, and the last parts of your body to shut down are those central, organs. So in kind of a similar fashion maybe, leprosy striking from the outside in, the stuff on the outside getting it first, or at least the effects of it. The other thing that occurred to me is, how many times have you bitten something and you feel it's just slightly too hard to crunch down on, or you feel the little seed get in between, or you feel just a little bit of a something that you without even thinking about it, you compensate for as you chew. But if you don't have the ability to feel those little tiny nuances, how many teeth do you crack and break? How many little seeds stay up there and cause an abscess or infection? Anyway, we're getting off a field a little bit, and I apologize, but there's just kind of an interesting sort of, you don't tend to put two and two together maybe. So kind of the summation of this anecdote, I think, is where he's able to look at skeletal evidence, and he relates a comment that he got from Margaret Mead, the anthropologist. Anybody remember that one? Because it's a very, very good insight.
The bones that had been broken, you could see that they had mended, and it was because of care.
Okay, so starting to find ancient bones that had mended was evidence of care, mutual care, and Margaret Mead says that's the start of civilization. That's where you can pinpoint it. Not necessarily to a particular tool. And anybody remember what bone she talked about in particular? It wasn't like fingers and hands.
Femur.
Your femur.
Femur.
Femur. Largest, strongest bone in the body. You break a femur, and that's a big deal. Frankly, most likely kill you if you're talking about living in the ancient world. But the only way to survive is for other people to care for you, and it's not going to be a short process. So, isn't that interesting that we can kind of date, at least in a general sense, society, civilization, something beyond, kind of open savagery, perhaps, because, in essence, love. Some sort of care for someone other than yourself. And
Makes
this,
sense it was an order of monks.
right,
It makes sense that it was an order of monks.
and that's this doctor in Copenhagen who had noticed that he was finding within these leprosy patients major bones that had broken and mended, and that pointed to the care from the monks. These were monks who even 500 years before had risked leprosy themselves in order to care for these people, and the evidence was the mended bones. So, pretty cool. Pretty cool. All right, so he moves on this next section, gets a little, makes a little CSI reference and starts talking about hidden strength. We mentioned that, I don't know, maybe a couple of classes ago, but about the forensic anthropology and how they can take a skull and try to recreate what their face might have looked like. And it is pretty interesting to think how much information can be taken from something that, from us lay people, I mean, other than really, really, really obvious things, can you tell anything from looking at a bone? Or a skull? I can't. And yet there is a lot of information conveyed there if you know how to see it. We would not look like ourselves without these bones. In our face, in our height, in the way we move. Something essential not just about our physical capability, but about who we understand ourselves to be as a person. And it's based on our bones.
That bit about the pelvis, you normally think of a male structure being more narrow, and that was exactly what he talked about.
Right.
That females were built to
birth children. That's right. That's right. And that's one of the first things, again, you watch one of these shows or forensic anthropology or something like that, they can distinguish male and female because there are some lasting structural differences that the bones preserve.
Right.
And 1,000 years from now, there will be nothing left of our bodies except perhaps bones. So this whole section also is mentioning just kind of the engineering marvel of the structure of bone. Anybody seen like bone tissue under a microscope or pictures of it?
No.
So
I have.
it has a kind of spongy look to it.
Yeah.
Lots of
Like circles.
yeah, like
What's that?
more of a lattice work or like a sponge, and there's lots of little spaces in there. It's not a solid pipe, you know. But even the hard material, it's not crystalline, but there's, you know, like fibrous maybe. And it's again, as a piece of engineering, what is so noteworthy about bone? Tom.
Under the microscope, there's nothing solid about it.
Right, nothing solid, and yet it's the most solid part of our body, and without it, we lose.
It has the greatest strength.
Yeah.
He compared it to wood and to steel.
Compared it to wood and to steel, like the properties, the good properties of both.
Mm-hmm.
So, how is bone like wood and better than wood?
Well, he said wood couldn't take pressure or the strain,
Right.
whereas steel could take both, but its weight.
What weighed you heavy? If we had bones made out of steel, we could still presumably walk around and stuff, as far as the not breaking bones. But the heaviness required to have the same amount of durability, 3 times heavier, just for that same structure, and yet. Not just the lightness, like wood is lighter than steel, but it's not as strong as steel, and bone is closer to it. Our bones absorb this impact, but not as a perfectly solid structure. So our bones can compress and flex, even these infinitesimal amounts that we don't realize, and it absorbs force and it spreads it out rather than taking it as a solid object and that force breaking it because it has nowhere to go. Really tall skyscrapers are actually built to sway. Did you know that?
Mm-hmm.
Because if they were built to be perfectly rigid, what would happen?
Crack.
Well,
They break.
yeah. Yeah, because the earth moves.
The earth moves, the wind blows, the sort of stresses that happen constantly, we don't think about it, except when you're that long and tall and exposed, there's no way that it could keep it up. And so they actually are designed to sway. I mean, not even so you could see it, but they sway just a little bit with the wind. They shift just a little bit as the ground moves. All these little things that our bones are capable of doing that metal rods can't.
In Katrina, there was a house that the water surge came up on, and it was an all steel framed home, and it just twisted it in a spiral.
Yeah. Yeah, so we are blessed with this material that we can't even design something in the laboratory that has that combination of durability and lightness and flexibility and hardness and everything else.
Well, they do use titanium for bone replacement.
Yes.
Is that it must be a lot lighter than steel?
Titanium, yeah, titanium is very strong and it is lighter than steel. It's kind of expensive, which is why we don't use as much of it as steel. But it still lacks some of the benefits of bone. It's still way heavier than bone, and not only can bone take that force and the twisting and everything else, But what happens when titanium cracks?
I don't have any idea.
It stays cracked.
Yeah,
It does not repair.
That's right.
yeah.
And every one of us has had our bones repair itself. You don't have to have a major fracture to have had something happen to, tiny stress fractures from walking around. Just the pains of growing, whatever it might be. But every single one of us has had bone tissue regenerate over and over and over and over again. And again, I'm kind of reminded of that whole, we don't think too much of spider webs, and they're just wispy and they break instantaneously, but the same diameter of spider webbing if you could coil it together is far stronger than steel. And again, it's kind of pointing to the miracle of creation, I think. This organic structure it's perfect for its purpose.
And wood or steel, those kind of materials couldn't produce cells or well, that's what it does, the red blood cell.
Right. So what's in the middle of our bones? There's a hollow portion.
Narrow.
And that marrow, which is so important to our daily life without even thinking about it.
Red blood.
Bones create what? White
Red.
corpuscles, is that right?
Both red and white, depending on
Red
depending
and
on
white?
where. Yeah. So depending on where in the body, the production of these blood cells, and it's an absolute necessity. That's why we talk about the possibility of people being able to marrow transplants because of leukemia or some sort of bloodborne disease, and they can actually cycle through someone's blood over a period of time and basically renew and refresh your own blood supply from inside of your bones with donor marrow tissue over the course of time.
Brother-in-law had Guillain-Barré syndrome, and they removed his blood and put other blood in. They did. That just was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like changing your oil. It's a little more involved.
Probably a little more painful.
Yeah. So now we're starting to shift in this description. He's kind of laying out a case, and as he moves to the hardness of bone, he's starting to kind of build his case that this structure isn't holding us back. This structure is, in essence, lifting us up. Bones don't cage us, bones free us. How so? How could something restrictive be freeing?
Because it allows us to have movement in different parts of our bodies. We don't have to move the whole blob together like an amoeba.
Right.
We can move individual parts separately at will.
Which would be impossible without a structure. Now you could argue, well, there are certain animals that because of their lack of bone structure can squeeze into tight spots or change their shape or whatever. If you've ever seen like a documentary about an octopus, and they can, fairly large-sized animal can go through these almost impossibly small cracks and holes because they have no bones in there, and that might seem kind of cool. Well, wouldn't it be interesting if we could do? Yeah, but these bones aren't holding us back and preventing us from slipping through tiny cracks. These bones are allowing us to do all of the daily life activities that we could not do without them. And he likens them to, in one example, to driving laws. How do those connect? Yeah, like speed limits and stop signs and what's the point he's getting at here?
Safety, being safe.
Right? And bones and these laws keep us safe, but how?
Okay, says something within us rebels against the notion that someone else determined how we should live. What? I'm missing the point.
Okay, so he's basically saying everyone at heart is a little bit of a contrarian. You know, we don't like to be told what we must do. It just somewhere, even people who are pretty compliant, at some point kind of don't appreciate being told everything. And so the idea of freedom just seems to be born in the human heart and doing what you want to do or how you like to do it. And so as we are here gathered all wearing face masks, you know, anything that constrains us kind of adds a layer of annoyance or frustration or a sense of being told what to do. And yet, and that's kind of the argument of face masks, really. Yes, you are limiting yourself, but you're doing it for a greater purpose. And in essence, if these face masks can mitigate the transmission of the disease, we can actually be out and about more rather than less. Same thing with the rules of the road. We have lines on the road, we have stop signs and stop lights, and we have things that we are supposed to do that you might say, well, I like driving the way I like to drive. Maybe I want to go this way, maybe I want to go that way, maybe I want to go through the red light. But these regulations don't actually limit us. These regulations actually give us freedom. Because taken collectively, if there were no rules to the road, we would all as a group be less free. Because what would happen on the highway if there were no lines, no lights, and no rules?
Be smacking
Tons
into
of
one another.
accidents.
Tons of accidents, constant jams,
Yeah.
people going this way and that way. You would never get to where you were trying to go. So having order then allows not just safety, but allows some of this movement to happen at all. There's on Wednesdays I go pick up Carrie at Valley View after school, and I mean I used to pick up all the kids, but it just so happens that today is Wednesday, and Wednesday's my Valley View day, and they've got like this little coiled snake loop that allows for parents to pick up kids, and it starts off with 2 lanes, and then it moves down to 1. Because you don't want 2 lanes when you're picking up kids, because then kids have to walk in between cars. You want it somehow to get it to 1 lane. And so there's around a curve where the lane narrows from 2 to 1, and there's a sign. Please take turns merging. Now, you could say, well, I'm going to merge when I want to merge. But that sign actually allows pickup to happen more efficiently for everybody. Because if everybody takes turns, then nobody tries to cut in front of each other, mostly. And you can know, I'm not trying to fight, we're not trying to jam into each other, causing accidents, having big long slowdowns or stoppages. But if we just kind of alternate and take our turns, everyone gets their kid.
Right.
Yeah.
What looks like a sign limiting, this is the way you have to do it.
Helpful.
It actually turned out to be for our own good.
Yeah.
The bones, that's because, well, we're limited in our shape. The bones aren't moving around. The bones aren't becoming bigger or smaller or taller or wider. The bones aren't, changing in configurations to make us look different. Boy, it'd be nicer to be a few feet taller so I could get the thing off that top shelf. And so we are limited physically in our space in the same way we are limited in time. We live in the present, not the past or the future. And that might seem like, well, it's a cage. It's preventing us. But this structure actually allows us the freedom of movement, physicality, and doing what we want to do and going where we want to go. That's where I think he's making the connection.
He mentioned one that I like because I used to read it and think, A researcher said it verifies the wisdom of the book of Proverbs. So many things in there are supposedly limiting.
Right. Except, what's more limiting than doing the wrong thing and then dying because of it? You know?
Pretty limiting.
It's pretty limiting.
Yeah, very.
What was it, like last year, there were the news reports about teenagers eating Tide Pods. It was like a challenge, and they would record themselves on one of the social media services. Except it's super poisonous and bad for you. Well, you can't make me. Well, why? Don't eat the poison. That's bad.
Crazy.
Well, who are you to tell me what's bad? Well, I mean, okay. You want to be free enough to kill yourself, I guess, but... So anyway, he's still making an argument, and it's not even bad. They're not stopping with the bones. He's now shifting from an example we understand to relating it to our skeletal structure, and now he's going to relate it further again to sort of the order of creation. If the bones maintain order within our body, an order that doesn't constrain us but actually frees us, well, then he also argues that God has made creation and humanity with an intended order. And when that order is followed, it's not just constraining, you have to do this or else. It actually frees us, because these are things that help us not only survive, they help us flourish. Such as what?
Well, such as the Ten Commandments.
Ten Commandments?
Well,
Oh, yeah.
I just mentioned Proverbs. They give
Proverbs?
advice.
Yeah,
Particularly this quote right at the end of that section. Those who follow biblical values live longer, enjoy life more, and are less diseased. The state God desires for us, shalom, results in a person fully alive, functioning optimally to the designer's specifications.
and that's, I mean, I don't know how more comprehensive you can settle it than that. And this is, again, the physician saying, he examines like all of these causes of disease and death, especially, like say, in a highly developed countries, and the top 10 of them are all lifestyle. They're not about fighting off some disease that's out to get us. They're precisely about the things we choose to do.
These are the consequences of our actions.
That's right. The consequences of our actions. And if we followed that created order, if we followed the manufacturer's directions and specifications, things would go better. Not just in a, hey, you're bumming me out, man, by telling me what I can't do. It's like, no. Don't floor the accelerator on your car and redline the engine. It sounds awesome and you're going to go fast, but then you will break it and then you have no car. Well, I want to do all these pleasurable things with my body, either with food or other people or dangerous activities because I get a thrill or a rush or a pleasure, but then it's that pleasure consumes you.
Yeah.
You either have to get more and more and more of it for less and less and less return, or it exposes you to risks that end your life far sooner and more painfully than otherwise. I really liked, this was kind of a, I'm not sure I've seen it done this way, but he's talking about the Ten Commandments, and he reverses them and it expresses them as positives.
I like
Instead of thou shalt not,
that. No, they're wonderful. Yeah.
and it's not even just a thou shalt, there's also like an explanation of why attached to it. And it just sort of sounds interesting.
And so often, well, the Ten Commandments, they're usually stated that way. They're aimed at you as a person. And these are talking more about God and what his ideas, what his aims are.
Right. Theologically, scripturally, the Ten Commandments are intended to mark Israel as God's chosen. And there's this real sense of, well, why do we have to do this stuff? While the laws of kosher eating, that's not a part of the Ten Commandments, but it's an outgrowth, especially through Leviticus. But there's this, well, I want to eat this thing or do this thing. These other countries can do that. And there's always this sense when I would go over that of hearing, well, why can't we do that at our house? My friend gets to do that. They get to stay up till 11 o'clock. They get to have pizza every night. Their mom lets them go off and do this, whatever. And the typical answer is, well, as long as you're a part of this family. Or as long as you live in this house, So the Ten Commandments, in essence, there's a real element of, well, all the other nations of the earth get to do these things. Why can't we? Well, as long as you are my chosen people, this is how you're going to live. And so part of there's a function within the Ten Commandments of marking Israel as different than everyone else by taking on some of these constraints. Now, some of them are universal goods, right? Like not murdering people and stealing their stuff would work in any culture or society. That would be a net plus. But some of the other things like keeping the Sabbath or honoring God only, I would still argue that's best for us. But another society, culture, nation, or whatever might be very confused or might not have a way to relate to that. Right. But basically, these are going to mark you as a part of my family, of living in this house. If your parents ever said anything, or you ever said something to kids about your behavior making a difference because it says something about the family. Like they know your last name. Yeah. The Ten Commandments say, these other nations know your last name. They know you're part of God's family. You ought to be different. And yet that difference can offer freedom. It can even give life. It can allow us to flourish. The keeping of kosher partly is to mark Israel as being different. But I have to say, not eating scavenger animals in the ancient world was probably a smart idea. Right? Don't eat pigs and bats and shellfish. Well, especially talking, if we're going 3,000 years ago, it's probably a lot safer for you to go ahead and avoid some of these creatures. All right.
It occurs to me that the Ten Commandments allowed Israel to always have a faithful remnant that survived all these centuries.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. There's something that is to mark their behavior even when there's not an Israel. There was not an Israel for a very long time. When the kingdoms separate and then one by one they're eventually conquered and people are carried out, there's a diaspora now for thousands of years. There was not an independent Israel or that nation, even if we're going to associate Judah for Israel, that existed without basically being owned, conquered, or a vassal of someone else for well over 2,000 years. 1948 and the creation of Israel as a state is the first time there is an independent Israel / Judah since the Babylonian captivity. So, even scattered throughout the world, Jews can remain Jewish. And when they are able to return home, what they have preserved can then be brought back. The rules that might have seemed like a bummer, oh man, I want to eat what I want to eat, I want to do what I want to do, have actually allowed you to survive in these awful circumstances. And it's like they can be replanted every generation.
Well, there had to be a faithful remnant for Jesus to even be born.
That's right. That's right, yeah. So, coming back out of being released from Babylonian captivity and being able to come back and rebuild Jerusalem, but it's not a free Jerusalem. It's still, different empires are going to own it from now on. But there is still there is still a Jewish people, even if there is not a Jewish nation or kingdom. And that's able to be continued for the promised Messiah to be born, and even continued now. So there is there's a phrase within. I'm shifting us to this last section. There's a phrase within theology or moral theology called Antinomianism. And with my mask, you might not hear it. Antinom. So nomianism. And nomos means law. Antinomianism means against the law. And that's not like, hey, I'm against the law. It means like freedom and grace in Christ means the law should not be followed. God has set us free in Christ. Therefore, that's what when Paul has to say, well, should I sin more so Christ's grace can abound more? He says, by no means. That's a terrible idea. But that's always been an issue of moral theology where people will say, oh, I've been freed, so I'm going to do this thing that used to be forbidden. Because now nothing is forbidden. And that's not just within Christianity, but the antinomianism can be in all sorts of facets of life. Kind of this streak of anarchy that says it's better to do not just what you want to do, but to go against convention, against society, to be countercultural for the sake of being countercultural. But where does that so often lead? Chaos. Anarchy. And what does chaos and anarchy do to the human person? Well,
Devalue?
It devalues you. You go to nothing. People suffer, especially the people who are least able to care for themselves. Let's go back to the Margaret Mead thing. In chaos and anarchy, who helps the other guy with a broken femur? Why would you?
Nobody.
Why would you do that? He can't help you any. He's just slowing you down. But if everything is up for grabs and it's all about you and your desires and your pleasures or whatever, then we're right back to that pre-civilized, savagery. And really, I think he's continued to build the case that not only is there something miraculous about the created order of this material God has put within us, it does the job so well, more effectively than anything we can invent, but it gives us ability, and even if the framework itself seems at first glance to be limiting, there is actually freedom in that. How many kids of the last few generations have grown up angry and purposeless because nobody told them no? Especially at a certain age, kids do better with boundaries. You ever think about why? Because they're not ready to make every decision for themselves. They need something they can count on and depend on. When they know that their mom and dad loves them, when they know that their mom and dad is going to have food for them every night, that there's going to be shelter, and they don't have to worry about the grown-up issues, they actually flourish. But for a small child, when everything is up for grabs, it puts a pressure on them they are not built yet to be ready for. And that freedom will do what you want. It doesn't make them better. It hurts them. It stunts them. But by giving them it's like saying, go play anywhere you want, and they can run out of traffic. Or building a fence and saying, anything in here, go nuts. Do whatever you feel like. Within that fence, they're safe. And they can explore and they can play, but they can do so in a fact that they can count on being okay. Pulling back to that nice little thing about, why does God have to make it so negative, these rules? Don't eat of the fruit of the garden. A positive rule will be much nicer. Except a negative rule can be more freeing than a positive rule. Did you catch that section? By saying, don't eat of the fruit of this one tree, it means everything else is yours to fool around with however you want. Instead of, you must eat this one, this one, this one, this one. Blah, blah, blah. Sometimes the positive is actually more limiting than we realize. This was an interestingly theoretical chapter. This was a chapter that had a little more making you think elements than a few of them have been, rather than a very emotional story at the end, just putting these pieces together for us to think through broader implications. So, that being said, anything else?
I really, I underlined the very last sentence. Bones intended to liberate us, enslave us when broken. So going to your example just a moment ago about the kid in the fenced-in yard, have at it within that fence, but if that fence is broken and the kid gets out, then they're kind of enslaved by whatever is out there that could harm them.
Right. Not only could the kid get out and get in trouble, something else could come in.
Yeah. You know what that made me think of? The teenager that runs away from home and gets out into the city, and especially the young girls, but even the boys,
Oh, yeah.
then get into prostitution. you know, and they want out. They want to go home, but they don't know how to get back there.
It seems so freeing to, I'm going to get out and do what I want and be out on my own. And it can be the most debilitating, dangerous, and limiting
It's frightening.
circumstances of their lives. Literal
Exactly.
slavery from pursuing what seems like freedom.
And it really enslaved, if they get caught, it got taken to the foreign countries where they truly are enslaved.
So it's, again, there's,
Within our
there,
country,
this was-
sadly, it's-
this is kind of a nicely kind of intellectual chapter, being able to think through stuff, offering ideas that we can kind of wrestle with, as well as just some of his stuff is very informative or even very compelling and emotional. And this one, I think, was giving us some stuff to chew on and think about.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? Well, thank you for putting up with a slightly awkward format because of the bad internet connection. Hopefully, the recording's going to go okay, and we can pick back up again next week and finish up this next section, and we won't have the constraints. We will do next week, and I think that's when we take a break, right?
So,
Okay? So one more
Yeah.
Wednesday, and then we'll take a couple of weeks, I think. Am I right on that?
Yeah.
today's the 9th,
Yes,
Yep.
Okay?
16th,
I
yeah.
think
Yes.
so.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, very much.
Thank you.
Good to see
Thank you.
everybody. Merry Christmas. If I,
Merry
well, we'll
Christmas.
see you
All right.
next week.
See you next week.
See you next week. Bye-bye.